Part 1, Sections 8 to 10 of Flatland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. Flatland, a romance of many dimensions, by Edwin Abbott Abbott. Part 1, Section 8, of the ancient practice of painting. If my readers have followed me with any attention up to this point, they will not be surprised to hear that life is somewhat dull in Flatland. I do not, of course, mean that there are not battles, conspiracies, tumults, factions, and all those other phenomena which are supposed to make history interesting. Nor would I deny that the strange mixture of the problems of life and the problems of mathematics, continually inducing conjecture, and giving the opportunity of immediate verification, imparts to our existence a zest which you in Spaceland can hardly comprehend. I speak now from the aesthetic and artistic point of view when I say that life with us is dull, aesthetically and artistically very dull indeed. How can it be otherwise, when all one's prospect, all one's landscapes, historical pieces, portraits, flowers, still life, are nothing but a single line, with no varieties except degrees of brightness and obscurity? It was not always thus. Colour, if tradition speaks the truth, once, for the space of half a dozen centuries or more, threw a transient charm upon the lives of our ancestors in the remotest ages. Some private individual, a Pentagon whose name is variously reported, having casually discovered the constituents of the simpler colours and a rudimentary method of painting, is said to have begun by decorating first his house, then his slaves, then his father, his sons and grandsons, lastly himself. The convenience, as well as the beauty of the results, commended themselves to all. Wherever Chromatistes, for by that name the most trustworthy authorities concur in calling him, turned his variegated frame, there he at once excited attention and attracted respect. No one now needed to feel him. No one mistook his front for his back. All his movements were readily ascertained by his neighbours, without the slightest strain on their powers of calculation. No one jostled him, or failed to make way for him. His voice was saved the labour of that exhausting utterance by which we colourless squares and pentagons are often forced to proclaim our individuality when we move amid a crowd of ignorant isosceles. The fashion spread like wildfire. Before a week was over, every square and triangle in the district had copied the example of Chromatistes, and only a few of the more conservative pentagons still held out. A month or two found even the dodecagons infected with the innovation. A year had not elapsed before the habit had spread to all but the very highest of the nobility. Needless to say, the custom soon made its way from the district of Chromatistes to surrounding regions, and within 2 generations no one in all Flatland was colourless except the women and the priests. Here nature herself appeared to erect a barrier, and to plead against extending the innovation to these 2 classes. Many-sidedness was almost essential as a pretext for the innovators. Distinction of sides is intended by nature to imply distinction of colours. Such was the sophism which in those days flew from mouth to mouth, converting whole towns at a time to the new culture. But manifestly to our priests and women this adage did not apply. The latter had only one side, and therefore, plurally and pedantically speaking, no sides. The former, if at least they would assert their claim to be really and truly circles, and not mere high-class polygons with an infinitely large number of infinitesimally small sides, were in the habit of boasting, what women confessed and deplored, that they also had no sides, being blessed with a perimeter of one line, or, in other words, a circumference. Hence it came to pass that these two classes could see no force in the so-called axiom about distinction of sides implying distinction of colour, and when all others had succumbed to the fascinations of corporal decoration, the priests and the women alone still remained pure from the pollution of paint. Immoral, licentious, anarchical, unscientific, call them by what names you will, yet, from an aesthetic point of view, those ancient days of the colour revolt were the glorious childhood of art in Flatland. A childhood, alas, that never ripened into manhood, nor even reached the blossom of youth. To live was then in itself a delight, because living implied seeing. Even at a small party the company was a pleasure to behold. The richly varied hues of the assembly in a church or theatre are said to have more than once proved too distracting for our greatest teachers and actors. But most ravishing of all is said to have been the unspeakable magnificence of a military review. The sight of a line of battle of 20,000 isosceles suddenly facing about and exchanging the sombre black of their bases for the orange and purple of the two sides including their acute angle. The militia of the equilateral triangles tricoloured in red, white, and blue. The mauve, ultramarine, gamboge, and burnt umber of the square artillerymen rapidly rotating near their vermilion guns. The dashing and flashing of the five-coloured and six-coloured pentagons and hexagons careering across the field in their offices of surgeons, geometricians, and aides-de-camp, all these may well have been sufficient to render credible the famous story how an illustrious circle, overcome by the artistic beauty of the forces under his command, threw aside his marshal's baton and his royal crown, exclaiming that he henceforth exchanged them for the artist's pencil. How great and glorious the sensuous development of these days must have been is in part indicated by the very language and vocabulary of the period. The commonest utterances of the commonest citizens in the time of the colour revolt seem to have been suffused with a richer tinge of word or thought. And to that era we are even now indebted for our finest poetry, and for whatever rhythm still remains in the more scientific utterance of these modern days. Section 9 of the Universal Colour Bill. But meanwhile the intellectual arts were fast decaying. The art of sight recognition, being no longer needed, was no longer practised, and the studies of geometry, statics, kinetics, and other kindred subjects came soon to be considered superfluous, and fell into disrepute and neglect even at our university. The inferior art of feeling speedily experienced the same fate at our elementary schools. Then the isosceles classes, asserting that the specimens were no longer used nor needed, and refusing to pay the customary tribute from the criminal classes to the service of education, waxed daily more numerous and more insolent on the strength of their immunity from the old burden, which had formerly exercised the twofold wholesome effect of at once taming their brutal nature and thinning their excessive numbers. Year by year the soldiers and artisans began more vehemently to assert, and with increasing truth, that there was no great difference between them and the very highest class of polygons, now that they were raised to an equality with the latter, and enabled to grapple with all the difficulties and solve all the problems of life, whether statical and kinetical, by the simple process of colour recognition. Not content with the natural neglect into which sight recognition was falling, they began boldly to demand the legal prohibition of all monopolising and aristocratic arts, and the consequent abolition of all endowments for the studies of sight recognition, mathematics, and feeling. Soon they began to insist that inasmuch as colour, which was a second nature, had destroyed the need of aristocratic distinctions, the law should follow in the same path, and that henceforth all individuals and all classes should be recognized as absolutely equal and entitled to equal rights. Finding the higher orders wavering and undecided, the leaders of the revolution advanced still further in their requirements, and at last demanded that all classes alike, the priests and the women not excepted, should do homage to colour by submitting to be painted. When it was objected that priests and women had no sides, they retorted that nature and expediency concurred in dictating that the front half of every human being, that is to say, the half containing his eye and mouth, should be distinguishable from his hinder half. They therefore brought before a general and extraordinary assembly of all the states of Flatland a bill proposing that in every woman the half containing the eye and mouth should be coloured red, and the other half green. The priests were to be painted in the same way, red being applied to that semicircle in which the eye and mouth formed the middle point, while the other or hinder semicircle was to be coloured green. There was no little cunning in this proposal, which indeed emanated not from any isosceles, for no being so degraded would have had angularity enough to appreciate, much less to devise, such a model of statecraft, but from an irregular circle, who, instead of being destroyed in his childhood, was reserved by a foolish indulgence to bring desolation on his country and destruction on myriads of his followers. On the one hand, the proposition was calculated to bring the women in all classes over to the side of the chromatic innovation. For by assigning to the women the same two colours as were assigned to the priests, the revolutionists thereby ensured that in certain positions every woman would appear like a priest, and be treated with corresponding respect and deference, a prospect that could not fail to attract the female sex in a mass. But by some of my readers the possibility of the identical appearance of priests and women under the new legislation may not be recognised. If so, a word or two will make it obvious. Imagine a woman duly decorated according to the new code, with the front half, i.e. the half containing eye and mouth, red, and with the hinder half green. Look at her from one side. Obviously you will see a straight line, half red, half green. Reader's note: the following paragraph makes reference to an accompanying diagram. The diagram shows a circle or priestly figure. If it is visualized as a clock face, 12 o'clock is marked M for the priest's mouth, 3 o'clock is marked B, and 9 o'clock is marked A. The diameter AB is drawn as a dotted line, and is extended outside the circle rightwards to a point which represents the position of the observer. Dotted lines are drawn downward and rightward from M towards this point, and upward and rightward from 6 o'clock to this point. A broad vertical line, CBD, is drawn between the dotted lines to indicate what the observer sees. CBD is bright at the centre and darkens sharply towards its ends. End of reader's note. Now imagine a priest whose mouth is at M and whose front semicircle, AMB, is consequently coloured red, while his hinder semicircle is green, so that the diameter AB divides the green from the red. If you contemplate the great man so as to have your eye in the same straight line as his dividing diameter, AB, what you will see will be a straight line, CBD, of which one half, CB, will be red, and the other, BD, green. The whole line, CD, will be rather shorter, perhaps, than that of a full-sized woman, and will shade off more rapidly towards its extremities, but the identity of the colours would give you an immediate impression of identity, if not class, making you neglectful of other details. Bear in mind the decay of sight recognition which threatened society at the time of the colour revolt. Add, too, the certainty that women would speedily learn to shade off their extremities so as to imitate the circles. It must then be surely obvious to you, my dear reader, that the Colour Bill placed us under a great danger of confounding a priest with a young woman. How attractive this prospect must have been to the frail sex may readily be imagined. They anticipated with delight the confusion that would ensue. At home they might hear political and ecclesiastical secrets intended not for them but for their husbands and brothers, and might even issue commands in the name of a priestly circle. Out of doors the striking combination of red and green, without addition of any other colours, would be sure to lead the common people into endless mistakes, and the women would gain whatever the circles lost in the deference of the passers-by. As for the scandal that would befall the circular class, if the frivolous and unseemly conduct of the women were imputed to them, and as to the consequent subversion of the constitution, the female sex could not be expected to give a thought to these considerations. Even in the households of the circles, the women were all in favour of the universal colour bill. The second object aimed at by the bill was the gradual demoralisation of the circles themselves. In the general intellectual decay, they still preserved their pristine clearness and strength of understanding. From their earliest childhood, familiarised in their circular households with the total absence of colour, the nobles alone preserved the sacred art of sight recognition, with all the advantages that result from that admirable training of the intellect. Hence, up to the date of the introduction of the universal colour bill, the circles had not only held their own, but even increased their lead of other classes by abstinence from the popular fashion. Now, therefore, the artful irregular, whom I described above as the real author of this diabolical bill, determined at one blow to lower the status of the hierarchy, by forcing them to submit to the pollution of colour, and at the same time to destroy their domestic opportunities of training in the art of sight recognition, so as to enfeeble their intellects by depriving them of their pure and colourless homes. Once subjected to the chromatic taint, every parental and every childish circle would demoralise each other. Only in discerning between the father and the mother would the circular infant find problems for the exercise of its understanding, problems too often likely to be corrupted by maternal impostures, with the result of shaking the child's faith in all logical conclusions. Thus, by degrees, the intellectual lustre of the priestly order would wane, and the road would then lie open for a total destruction of all aristocratic legislature and for the subversion of our privileged classes. Section 10. Of the suppression of the chromatic sedition. The agitation for the universal colour bill continued for 3 years, and up to the last moment of that period it seemed as though anarchy were destined to triumph. A whole army of polygons, who turned out to fight as private soldiers, was utterly annihilated by a superior force of isosceles triangles, the squares and pentagons meanwhile remaining neutral. Worse than all, some of the ablest circles fell a prey to conjugal fury. Infuriated by political animosity, the wives in many a noble household wearied their lords with prayers to give up their opposition to the colour bill, and some, finding their entreaties fruitless, fell on and slaughtered their innocent children and husbands, perishing themselves in the act of carnage.
It is recorded that during that triennial agitation no less than 23 circles perished in domestic discord. Great indeed was the peril. It seemed as though the priests had no choice between submission and extermination, when suddenly the course of events was completely changed by one of those picturesque incidents which statesmen ought never to neglect, often to anticipate, and sometimes perhaps to originate, because of the absurdly disproportionate power with which they appeal to the sympathies of the populace. It happened that an isosceles of a low type, with a brain little if at all above 4 degrees, accidentally dabbling in the colours of some tradesman whose shop he had plundered, painted himself, or caused himself to be painted, for the story varies, with the 12 colours of a dodecahedron. Going into the market-place, he accosted in a feigned voice a maiden, the orphan daughter of a noble polygon, whose affection in former days he had sought in vain, and by a series of deceptions, aided on the one side by a string of lucky accidents too long to relate, and on the other by an almost inconceivable fatuity and neglect of ordinary precautions on the part of the relations of the bride, he succeeded in consummating the marriage. The unhappy girl committed suicide on discovering the fraud to which she had been subjected. When the news of this catastrophe spread from state to state, the minds of the women were violently agitated. Sympathy with the miserable victim, and anticipations of similar deceptions for themselves, their sisters, and their daughters, made them now regard the colour bill in an entirely new aspect. Not a few openly avowed themselves converted to antagonism; the rest needed only a slight stimulus to make a similar avowal. Seizing this favourable opportunity, the circles hastily convened an extraordinary assembly of the States, and besides the usual guard of convicts, they secured the attendance of a large number of reactionary women. Amidst an unprecedented concourse, the chief circle of those days, by name Pantocyclus, arose to find himself hissed and hooted by 120,000 isosceles. But he secured silence by declaring that henceforth the circles would enter on a policy of concession. Yielding to the wishes of the majority, they would accept the colour bill. The uproar being at once converted to applause, he invited Chromatistes, the leader of the sedition, into the centre of the hall, to receive, in the name of his followers, the submission of the hierarchy. Then followed a speech, a masterpiece of rhetoric, which occupied nearly a day in the delivery, and to which no summary can do justice. With a grave appearance of impartiality, he declared that as they were now finally committing themselves to reform or innovation, it was desirable that they should take one last view of the perimeter of the whole subject, its defects as well as its advantages. Gradually introducing the mention of the dangers to the tradesmen, the professional classes, and the gentlemen, he silenced the rising murmurs of the isosceles by reminding them that, in spite of all these defects, he was willing to accept the bill if it was approved by the majority. But it was manifest that all, except the isosceles, were moved by his words, and were either neutral or averse to the bill. Turning now to the workmen, he asserted that their interests must not be neglected, and that, if they intended to accept the colour bill, they ought at least to do so with a full view of the consequences. Many of them, he said, were on the point of being admitted to the class of the regular triangles. Others anticipated for their children a distinction they could not hope for themselves. That honourable ambition would now have to be sacrificed. With the universal adoption of colour, all distinctions would cease. Regularity would be confused with irregularity. Development would give place to retrogression. The workman would, in a few generations, be degraded to the level of the military, or even the convict class. Political power would be in the hands of the greatest number, that is to say, the criminal classes, who were already more numerous than the workmen, and would soon outnumber all the other classes put together, when the usual compensative laws of nature were violated. A subdued murmur of assent ran through the ranks of the artisans, and Chromatistes, in alarm, attempted to step forward and address them; but he found himself encompassed with guards, and forced to remain silent, while the chief circle, in a few impassioned words, made a final appeal to the women, exclaiming that, if the Colour Bill passed, no marriage would henceforth be safe, no woman's honour secure. Fraud, deception, hypocrisy would pervade every household. Domestic bliss would share the fate of the constitution, and pass to speedy perdition. Sooner than this, he cried, come death. At these words, which were the preconcerted signal for action, the isosceles convicts fell on and transfixed the wretched Chromatistes. The regular classes, opening their ranks, made way for a band of women, who, under direction of the circles, moved, back foremost, invisibly and unerringly, upon the unconscious soldiers. The artisans, imitating the example of their betters, also opened their ranks. Meantime, bands of convicts occupied every entrance with an impenetrable phalanx. The battle, or rather carnage, was of short duration. Under the skilful generalship of the circles, almost every woman's charge was fatal, and very many extracted their sting uninjured, ready for a second slaughter. But no second blow was needed. The rabble of the isosceles did the rest of the business for themselves. Surprised, leaderless, attacked in front by invisible foes, and finding egress cut off by the convicts behind them, they at once, after their manner, lost all presence of mind, and raised the cry of treachery. This sealed their fate. Every isosceles now saw and felt a foe in every other. In half an hour not one of that vast multitude was living, and the fragments of 70,000 of the criminal class, slain by one another's angles, attested the triumph of order. The circles delayed not to push their victory to the uttermost. The working men they spared but decimated. The militia of the equilaterals was at once called out, and every triangle suspected of irregularity on reasonable grounds was destroyed by court-martial, without the formality of exact measurement by the social board. The homes of the military and artisan classes were inspected in a course of visitations extending through upwards of a year; and during that period every town, village, and hamlet was systematically purged of that excess of the lower orders which had been brought about by the neglect to pay the tribute of criminals to the schools and university, and by the violation of other natural laws of the constitution of Flatland. Thus the balance of classes was again restored. Needless to say that henceforth the use of colour was abolished, and its possession prohibited. Even the utterance of any word denoting colour, except by the circles or by qualified scientific teachers, was punished by a severe penalty. Only at our university, in some of the very highest and most esoteric classes, which I myself have never been privileged to attend, it is understood that the sparing use of colour is still sanctioned, for the purpose of illustrating some of the deeper problems of mathematics. But of this I can only speak from hearsay. Elsewhere in Flatland colour is now non-existent. The art of making it is known to only one living person, the chief circle for the time being, and by him it is handed down on his deathbed to none but his successor. One manufactory alone produces it, and, lest the secret should be betrayed, the workmen are annually consumed and fresh ones introduced. So great is the terror with which even now our aristocracy looks back to the far distant days of the agitation for the universal colour bill. End of section 10. Recording by Ruth Golding. Sections 11 and 12 of Flatland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. Flatland, a Romance of Many Dimensions, by Edwin Abbott Abbott. Part 1, Section 11, Concerning Our Priests. It is high time that I should pass from these brief and discursive notes about things in Flatland to the central event of this book, my initiation into the mysteries of space. That is my subject. All that has gone before is merely preface. For this reason, I must omit many matters of which the explanation would not, I flatter myself, be without interest for my readers, as, for example, our method of propelling and stopping ourselves, although destitute of feet; the means by which we give fixity to structures of wood, stone, or brick, although of course we have no hands, nor can we lay foundations as you can, nor avail ourselves of the lateral pressure of the earth; the manner in which the rain originates in the intervals between our various zones, so that the northern regions do not intercept the moisture from falling on the southern; the nature of our hills and mines, our trees and vegetables, our seasons and harvests; our alphabet and method of writing adapted to our linear tablets. These and 100 other details of our physical existence I must pass over, nor do I mention them now except to indicate to my readers that their omission proceeds not from forgetfulness on the part of the author, but from his regard for the time of the reader. Yet before I proceed to my legitimate subject, some few final remarks will no doubt be expected by my readers upon those pillars and mainstays of the constitution of Flatland, the controllers of our conduct and shapers of our destiny, the objects of universal homage and almost of adoration. Need I say that I mean our circles or priests? When I call them priests, let me not be understood as meaning no more than the term denotes with you. With us, our priests are administrators of all business, art, and science, directors of trade, commerce, generalship, architecture, engineering, education, statesmanship, legislature, morality, theology. Doing nothing themselves, they are the causes of everything worth doing that is done by others. Although popularly every one called a circle is deemed a circle, yet among the better educated classes it is known that no circle is really a circle, but only a polygon with a very large number of very small sides. In proportion to the number of the sides, the polygon approximates to a circle, and when the number is very great, say for example 300 or 400, it is extremely difficult for the most delicate touch to feel any polygonal angles. Let me say rather, it would be difficult, for, as I have shown above, recognition by feeling is unknown among the highest society, and to feel a circle would be considered a most audacious insult. This habit of abstention from feeling in the best society enables a circle the more easily to sustain the veil of mystery in which from his earliest years he is wont to enwrap the exact nature of his perimeter or circumference. 3 feet being the average perimeter, it follows that, in a polygon of 300 sides, each side will be no more than the 100th part of a foot in length, or little more than the 10th part of an inch; and in a polygon of 600 or 700 sides, the sides are little larger than the diameter of a Spaceland pinhead. It is always assumed, by courtesy, that the chief circle for the time being has 10,000 sides. The ascent of the posterity of the circles in the social scale is not restricted, as it is among the lower regular classes, by the law of nature, which limits the increase of sides to 1 in each generation. If it were so, the number of sides in a circle would be a mere question of pedigree and arithmetic, and the 497th descendant of an equilateral triangle would necessarily be a polygon with 500 sides. But this is not the case. Nature's law prescribes 2 antagonistic decrees affecting circular propagation. First, that as the race climbs higher in the scale of development, so development shall proceed at an accelerated pace. Second, that in the same proportion the race shall become less fertile. Consequently, in the home of a polygon of 400 or 500 sides, it is rare to find a son. More than one is never seen. On the other hand, the son of a 500-sided polygon has been known to possess 550 or even 600 sides. Art also steps in to help the process of the higher evolution. Our physicians have discovered that the small and tender sides of an infant polygon of the higher class can be fractured and his whole frame reset with such exactness that a polygon of 200 or 300 sides sometimes, by no means always, for the process is attended with serious risk, but sometimes overleaps 200 or 300 generations, and as it were doubles at a stroke the number of his progenitors and the nobility of his descent. Many a promising child is sacrificed in this way. Scarcely 1 out of 10 survives. Yet so strong is the parental ambition among those polygons who are, as it were, on the fringe of the circular class, that it is very rare to find a nobleman of that position in society who has neglected to place his firstborn son in the circular neo-therapeutic gymnasium before he has attained the age of a month. 1 year determines success or failure. At the end of that time the child has, in all probability, added 1 more to the tombstones that crowd the neo-therapeutic cemetery. But on rare occasions a glad procession bears back the little one to his exultant parents, no longer a polygon, but a circle, at least by courtesy. And a single instance of so blessed a result induces multitudes of polygonal parents to submit to similar domestic sacrifices, which have a dissimilar issue. Section 12 of the Doctrine of our Priests. As to the doctrine of the circles, it may briefly be summed up in a single maxim: attend to your configuration. Whether political, ecclesiastical, or moral, all their teaching has for its object the improvement of individual and collective configuration, with special reference, of course, to the configuration of the circles, to which all other objects are subordinated. It is the merit of the circles that they have effectually suppressed those ancient heresies which led men to waste energy and sympathy in the vain belief that conduct depends upon will, effort, training, encouragement, praise, or anything else but configuration. It was Pantocyclus, the illustrious circle mentioned above as the queller of the colour revolt, who first convinced mankind that configuration makes the man. That if, for example, you are born an isosceles with 2 uneven sides, you will assuredly go wrong unless you have them made even, for which purpose you must go to the isosceles hospital. Similarly, if you are a triangle or square, or even a polygon, born with any irregularity, you must be taken to one of the regular hospitals to have your disease cured. Otherwise you will end your days in the state prison, or by the angle of the state executioner. All faults or defects, from the slightest misconduct to the most flagitious crime, Pantocyclus attributed to some deviation from perfect regularity in the bodily figure, caused perhaps, if not congenital, by some collision in a crowd, by neglect to take exercise, or by taking too much of it, or even by a sudden change of temperature resulting in a shrinkage or expansion in some too susceptible part of the frame. Therefore, concluded that illustrious philosopher, neither good conduct nor bad conduct is a fit subject in any sober estimation for either praise or blame. For why should you praise, for example, the integrity of a square who faithfully defends the interests of his client, when you ought, in reality, rather to admire the exact precision of his rectangles? Or again, why blame a lying, thievish isosceles, when you ought rather to deplore the incurable inequality of his sides? Theoretically, this doctrine is unquestionable, but it has practical drawbacks. In dealing with an isosceles, if a rascal pleads that he cannot help stealing because of his unevenness, you reply that for that very reason, because he cannot help being a nuisance to his neighbours, you, the magistrate, cannot help sentencing him to be consumed, and there's an end of the matter. But in little domestic difficulties, where the penalty of consumption or death is out of the question, this theory of configuration sometimes comes in awkwardly; and I must confess that occasionally, when one of my own hexagonal grandsons pleads, as an excuse for his disobedience, that a sudden change of the temperature has been too much for his perimeter, and that I ought to lay the blame not on him but on his configuration, which can only be strengthened by abundance of the choicest sweetmeats, I neither see my way logically to reject, nor practically to accept, his conclusions. For my own part, I find it best to assume that a good sound scolding or castigation has some latent and strengthening influence on my grandson's configuration, though I own that I have no grounds for thinking so. At all events, I am not alone in my way of extricating myself from this dilemma, for I find that many of the highest circles, sitting as judges in law courts, use praise and blame towards regular and irregular figures; and in their homes I know by experience that, when scolding their children, they speak about right or wrong as vehemently and passionately as if they believed that these names represented real existences, and that a human figure is really capable of choosing between them. Consistently carrying out their policy of making configuration the leading idea in every mind, the circles reverse the nature of that commandment which in Spaceland regulates the relations between parents and children. With you, children are taught to honour their parents. With us, next to the circles, who are the chief object of universal homage, a man is taught to honour his grandson, if he has one, or if not, his son. By honour, however, is by no means meant indulgence, but a reverent regard for their highest interests. And the circles teach that the duty of fathers is to subordinate their own interests to those of posterity, thereby advancing the welfare of the whole state, as well as that of their own immediate descendants. The weak point in the system of the circles, if a humble square may venture to speak of anything circular as containing any element of weakness, appears to me to be found in their relations with women. As it is of the utmost importance for society that irregular births should be discouraged, it follows that no woman who has any irregularities in her ancestry is a fit partner for one who desires that his posterity should rise by regular degrees in the social scale. Now, the irregularity of a male is a matter of measurement, but as all women are straight, and therefore visibly regular, so to speak, one has to devise some other means of ascertaining what I may call their invisible irregularity; that is to say, their potential irregularities as regards possible offspring. This is effected by carefully kept pedigrees, which are preserved and supervised by the state; and without a certified pedigree no woman is allowed to marry. Now it might have been supposed that a circle, proud of his ancestry and regardful for a posterity which might possibly issue hereafter in a chief circle, would be more careful than any other to choose a wife who had no blot on her escutcheon. But it is not so. The care in choosing a regular wife appears to diminish as one rises in the social scale. Nothing would induce an aspiring isosceles, who had hopes of generating an equilateral son, to take a wife who reckoned a single irregularity among her ancestors. A square or pentagon, who is confident that his family is steadily on the rise, does not inquire above the 500th generation. A hexagon or dodecahedron is even more careless of the wife's pedigree. But a circle has been known deliberately to take a wife who has had an irregular great-grandfather, and all because of some slight superiority of lustre, or because of the charms of a low voice, which, with us, even more than with you, is thought an excellent thing in woman. Such ill-judged marriages are, as might be expected, barren, if they do not result in positive irregularity or in diminution of sides. But none of these evils have hitherto proved sufficiently deterrent. The loss of a few sides in a highly developed polygon is not easily noticed, and is sometimes compensated by a successful operation in the neo-therapeutic gymnasium, as I have described above. And the circles are too much disposed to acquiesce in infecundity as a law of the superior development. Yet, if this evil be not arrested, the gradual diminution of the circular class may soon become more rapid, and the time may not be far distant when, the race being no longer able to produce a chief circle, the constitution of Flatland must fall. One other word of warning suggests itself to me, though I cannot so easily mention a remedy, and this also refers to our relations with women. About 300 years ago, it was decreed by the chief circle that, since women are deficient in reason but abundant in emotion, they ought no longer to be treated as rational, nor receive any mental education. The consequence was that they were no longer taught to read, nor even to master arithmetic enough to enable them to count the angles of their husband or children, and hence they sensibly declined during each generation in intellectual power, and this system of female non-education, or quietism, still prevails. My fear is that, with the best intentions, this policy has been carried so far as to react injuriously on the male sex. For the consequence is that, as things now are, we males have to lead a kind of bilingual, and I may almost say bi-mental existence. With the women we speak of love, duty, right, wrong, pity, hope, and other irrational and emotional conceptions which have no existence, and the fiction of which has no object except to control feminine exuberances. But among ourselves and in our books we have an entirely different vocabulary, and I may almost say idiom. Love then becomes the anticipation of benefits, duty becomes necessity or fitness, and other words are correspondingly transmuted. Moreover, among women we use language implying the utmost deference for their sex, and they fully believe that the chief circle himself is not more devoutly adored by us than they are. But behind their backs they are both regarded and spoken of, by all except the very young, as being little better than mindless organisms. Our theology also in the women's chambers is entirely different from our theology elsewhere. Now, my humble fear is that this double training, in language as well as in thought, imposes somewhat too heavy a burden upon the young, especially when, at the age of 3 years old, they are taken from the maternal care and taught to unlearn the old language, except for the purpose of repeating it in the presence of their mothers and nurses, and to learn the vocabulary and idiom of science. Already, methinks, I discern a weakness in the grasp of mathematical truth at the present time, as compared with the more robust intellect of our ancestors 300 years ago.
I say nothing of the possible danger if a woman should ever surreptitiously learn to read, and convey to her sex the result of her perusal of a single popular volume; nor of the possibility that the indiscretion or disobedience of some infant male might reveal to a mother the secrets of the logical dialect. On the simple ground of the enfeebling of the male intellect, I rest this humble appeal to the highest authorities to reconsider the regulations of female education. End of section 12 and of part 1. Recording by Ruth Golding. Sections 13 and 14 of Flatland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. Flatland, a romance of many dimensions by Edwin Abbott Abbott. Part 2. Other Worlds. O brave new worlds that have such people in them. Section 13. How I had a vision of Lineland. It was the last day but one of the 1999th year of our era, and the first day of the long vacation. Having amused myself till a late hour with my favourite recreation of geometry, I had retired to rest with an unsolved problem in my mind. In the night I had a dream. Reader's note: the following paragraph makes reference to a diagram. The diagram is headed "My View of Lineland." Beneath this title, and centrally placed, is a square labelled "Myself." Under that, from left to right on a horizontal plane, are 4 dots labelled "Women," a short dash labelled "A Boy," 6 longer dashes marked "Men," then, directly below "Myself," a thick dash labelled "The King," with an eye looking out from either end. Under the eyes is written "The King's eyes much larger than the reality," showing that His Majesty could see nothing but a point. The horizontal line then continues towards the right, with 7 dashes marked "Men," 1 dash marked "A Boy," and 7 dots marked "Women." End of reader's note. I saw before me a vast multitude of small straight lines, which I naturally assumed to be women, interspersed with other beings still smaller and of the nature of lustrous points, all moving to and fro in one and the same straight line, and, as nearly as I could judge, with the same velocity. A noise of confused multitudinous chirping or twittering issued from them at intervals as long as they were moving, but sometimes they ceased from motion, and then all was silence. Approaching one of the largest of what I thought to be women, I accosted her, but received no answer. A second and third appeal on my part were equally ineffectual. Losing patience at what appeared to me intolerable rudeness, I brought my mouth into a position full in front of her mouth, so as to intercept her motion, and loudly repeated my question. "Woman, what signifies this concourse, and this strange and confused chirping, and this monotonous motion to and fro in one and the same straight line?" "I am no woman," replied the small line. "I am the monarch of the world. But thou, whence intrudest thou into my realm of Lineland?" Receiving this abrupt reply, I begged pardon if I had in any way startled or molested His Royal Highness, and, describing myself as a stranger, I besought the King to give me some account of his dominions. But I had the greatest possible difficulty in obtaining any information on points that really interested me; for the monarch could not refrain from constantly assuming that whatever was familiar to him must also be known to me, and that I was simulating ignorance in jest. However, by persevering questions, I elicited the following facts. It seemed that this poor ignorant monarch, as he called himself, was persuaded that the straight line which he called his kingdom
and in which he passed his existence, constituted the whole of the world, and indeed the whole of space. Not being able either to move or to see, save in his straight line, he had no conception of anything out of it. Though he had heard my voice when I first addressed him, the sounds had come to him in a manner so contrary to his experience that he had made no answer, seeing no man, as he expressed it, and hearing a voice, as it were, from my own intestines. Until the moment when I placed my mouth in his world, he had neither seen me nor heard anything except confused sounds beating against what I called his side, but what he called his inside or stomach. Nor had he, even now, the least conception of the region from which I had come. Outside his world, or line, all was a blank to him; nay, not even a blank, for a blank implies space; say, rather, all was non-existent. His subjects, of whom the small lines were men, and the points women, were all alike confined in motion and eyesight to that single straight line, which was their world. It need scarcely be added that the whole of their horizon was limited to a point. Nor could any one ever see anything but a point. Man, woman, child, thing, each was a point to the eye of a Linelander. Only by the sound of the voice could sex or age be distinguished. Moreover, as each individual occupied the whole of the narrow path, so to speak, which constituted his universe, and no one could move to the right or left to make way for passers-by, it followed that no Linelander could ever pass another. Once neighbours, always neighbours. Neighbourhood with them was like marriage with us. Neighbours remained neighbours till death did them part. Such a life, with all vision limited to a point, and all motion to a straight line, seemed to me inexpressibly dreary, and I was surprised to note the vivacity and cheerfulness of the King. Wondering whether it was possible, amid circumstances so unfavourable to domestic relations, to enjoy the pleasures of conjugal union, I hesitated for some time to question his Royal Highness on so delicate a subject; but at last I plunged into it by abruptly inquiring as to the health of his family. "My wives and children," he replied, "are well and happy." Staggered at this answer, for in the immediate proximity of the monarch, as I had noted in my dream before I entered Lineland, there were none but men, I ventured to reply, "Pardon me, but I cannot imagine how your Royal Highness can at any time either see or approach their Majesties, when there are at least half a dozen intervening individuals whom you can neither see through nor pass by. Is it possible that, in Lineland, proximity is not necessary for marriage and for the generation of children?" "How can you ask so absurd a question?" replied the monarch. "If it were indeed as you suggest, the universe would soon be depopulated. No, no, neighbourhood is needless for the union of hearts, and the birth of children is too important a matter to have been allowed to depend on such an accident as proximity. You cannot be ignorant of this. Yet, since you are pleased to affect ignorance, I will instruct you as if you were the veriest baby in Lineland. Know, then, that marriages are consummated by means of the faculty of sound and the sense of hearing. You are, of course, aware that every man has two mouths or voices, as well as two eyes, a bass at one and a tenor at the other of his extremities. I should not mention this, but that I have been unable to distinguish your tenor in the course of our conversation." I replied that I had but one voice, and that I had not been aware that his Royal Highness had two. "That confirms my impression," said the King, "that you are not a man, but a feminine monstrosity with a bass voice and an utterly uneducated ear. But to continue. Nature herself having ordained that every man should wed 2 wives. Why 2? asked I. You carry your affected simplicity too far, he cried. How can there be a completely harmonious union without the combination of the 4 in 1, viz. the bass and tenor of the man, and the soprano and contralto of the 2 women? But supposing, said I, that a man should prefer 1 wife, or 3? It is impossible, he said. It is as inconceivable as that 2 and 1 should make 5, or that the human eye should see a straight line. I would have interrupted him, but he proceeded as follows. Once in the middle of each week, a law of nature compels us to move to and fro with a rhythmic motion of more than usual violence, which continues for the time you would take to count 101. In the midst of this choral dance, at the 51st pulsation, the inhabitants of the universe pause in full career, and each individual sends forth his richest, fullest, sweetest strain. It is in this decisive moment that all our marriages are made. So exquisite is the adaptation of bass to treble, of tenor to contralto, that oftentimes the loved ones, though 20,000 leagues away, recognise at once the responsive note of their destined lover, and penetrating the paltry obstacles of distance, love unites the 3. The marriage in that instant consummated results in a 3-fold male and female offspring, which takes its place in Lineland. What, always 3-fold? said I. Must 1 wife, then, always have twins? Bass-voiced monstrosity! Yes, replied the king. How else could the balance of the sexes be maintained, if 2 girls were not born for every boy? Would you ignore the very alphabet of nature? He ceased, speechless for fury, and some time elapsed before I could induce him to resume his narrative. You will not, of course, suppose that every bachelor among us finds his mates at the first wooing in this universal marriage chorus. On the contrary, the process is by most of us many times repeated. Few are the hearts whose happy lot it is at once to recognise in each other's voices the partner intended for them by Providence, and to fly into a reciprocal and perfectly harmonious embrace. With most of us the courtship is of long duration. The wooers' voices may perhaps accord with 1 of the future wives, but not with both, or not at first with either, or the soprano and contralto may not quite harmonise. In such cases nature has provided that every weekly chorus shall bring the 3 lovers into closer harmony. Each trial of voice, each fresh discovery of discord, almost imperceptibly induces the less perfect to modify his or her vocal utterance, so as to approximate to the more perfect. And after many trials and many approximations, the result is at last achieved. There comes a day at last when, while the wonted marriage chorus goes forth from universal Lineland, the 3 far-off lovers suddenly find themselves in exact harmony, and before they are aware, the wedded triplet is wrapped vocally into a duplicate embrace, and nature rejoices over 1 more marriage and over 3 more births. Section 14. How I vainly tried to explain the nature of Flatland. Thinking that it was time to bring down the monarch from his raptures to the level of common sense, I determined to endeavour to open up to him some glimpses of the truth, that is to say, of the nature of things in Flatland. So I began thus. How does your Royal Highness distinguish the shapes and positions of his subjects? I, for my part, noticed by the sense of sight, before I entered your kingdom, that some of your people are lines and others points, and that some of the lines are larger,
"You speak of an impossibility," interrupted the King. "You must have seen a vision, for to detect the difference between a line and a point by the sense of sight is, as every one knows, in the nature of things, impossible. But it can be detected by the sense of hearing, and by the same means my shape can be exactly ascertained. Behold me, I am a line, the longest in Lineland, over 6 inches of space."
"Of length," I ventured to suggest.
"Fool," said he, "space is length. Interrupt me again, and I have done."
I apologised, but he continued scornfully,
"Since you are impervious to argument, you shall hear with your ears how by means of my 2 voices I reveal my shape to my wives, who are at this moment 6,000 miles, 70 yards, 2 feet, 8 inches away, the one to the north, the other to the south. Listen, I call to them."
He chirruped, and then complacently continued, "My wives at this moment receiving the sound of one of my voices, closely followed by the other, and perceiving that the latter reaches them after an interval in which sound can traverse 6.457 inches, infer that one of my mouths is 6.457 inches further from them than the other, and accordingly know my shape to be 6.457 inches. But you will of course understand that my wives do not make this calculation every time they hear my 2 voices. They made it once for all before we were married. But they could make it at any time, and in the same way I can estimate the shape of any of my male subjects by the sense of sound." "But how," said I, "if a man feigns a woman's voice with one of his 2 voices, or so disguises his southern voice that it cannot be recognised as the echo of the northern? May not such deceptions cause great inconvenience? And have you no means of checking frauds of this kind by commanding your neighbouring subjects to feel one another?" This, of course, was a very stupid question, for feeling could not have answered the purpose, but I asked with the view of irritating the monarch, and I succeeded perfectly.
"What?" cried he in horror. "Explain your meaning."
"Feel, touch, come into contact," I replied.
"If you mean by feeling," said the King, "approaching so close as to leave no space between 2 individuals, know, stranger, that this offence is punishable in my dominions by death, and the reason is obvious. The frail form of a woman, being liable to be shattered by such an approximation, must be preserved by the state. But since women cannot be distinguished by the sense of sight from man, the law ordains universally that neither man nor woman shall be approached so closely as to destroy the interval between the approximator and the approximated. And indeed, what possible purpose would be served by this illegal and unnatural excess of approximation which you call touching, when all the ends of so brutal and coarse a process are attained at once more easily and more exactly by the sense of hearing? As to your suggested danger of deception, it is non-existent, for the voice, being the essence of one's being, cannot be thus changed at will. But come, suppose that I had the power of passing through solid things, so that I could penetrate my subjects one after another, even to the number of 1 billion, verifying the size and distance of each by the sense of feeling. How much time and energy would be wasted in this clumsy and inaccurate method! Whereas now, in one moment of audition, I take, as it were, the census and statistics, local, corporal, mental, and spiritual, of every living being in Lineland. Hark! Only hark!" So saying, he paused and listened, as if in an ecstasy, to a sound which seemed to me no better than a tiny chirping from an innumerable multitude of Lilliputian grasshoppers.
"Truly," replied I, "your sense of hearing serves you in good stead, and fills up many of your deficiencies. But permit me to point out that your life in Lineland must be deplorably dull. To see nothing but a point! Not even to be able to contemplate a straight line! Nay, not even to know what a straight line is! To see, yet to be cut off from those linear prospects which are vouchsafed to us in Flatland! Better surely to have no sense of sight at all than to see so little. I grant you I have not your discriminative faculty of hearing, for the concert of all Lineland which gives you such intense pleasure is to me no better than a multitudinous twittering or chirping. But at least I can discern by sight a line from a point. And let me prove it. Just before I came into your kingdom, I saw you dancing from left to right, and then from right to left, with 7 men and a woman in your immediate proximity on the left, and 8 men and 2 women on your right. Is not this correct?" "It is correct," said the King, "so far as the numbers and sexes are concerned, though I know not what you mean by right and left. But I deny that you saw these things, for how could you see the line, that is to say, the inside, of any man? But you must have heard these things, and then dreamed that you saw them. And let me ask what you mean by those words left and right. I suppose it is your way of saying northward and southward." "Not so," replied I. "Besides your motion of northward and southward, there is another motion which I call from right to left." King: "Exhibit to me, if you please, this motion from left to right." I: "Nay, that I cannot do, unless you could step out of your line altogether." King: "Out of my line? Do you mean out of the world? Out of space?" I: "Well, yes, out of your world, out of your space. For your space is not the true space. True space is a plane, but your space is only a line." King: "If you cannot indicate this motion from left to right by yourself moving in it, then I beg you to describe it to me in words." I: "If you cannot tell your right side from my left, I fear that no words of mine can make my meaning clear to you. But surely you cannot be ignorant of so simple a distinction?" King: "I do not in the least understand you." I: "Alas! how shall I make it clear? When you move straight on, does it not sometimes occur to you that you could move in some other way, turning your eye round so as to look in the direction to which your side is now fronting? In other words, instead of always moving in the direction of one of your extremities, do you never feel a desire to move in the direction, so to speak, of your side?" King: "Never! And what do you mean? How can a man's inside front in any direction? Or how can a man move in the direction of his inside?" I: "Well, then, since words cannot explain the matter, I will try deeds, and will move gradually out of Lineland in the direction which I desire to indicate to you." Reader's note: the following paragraph makes reference to a diagram. The diagram shows a horizontal line. At the left is marked Lineland, with an arrow pointing rightward. At the right, on the line, is a broad dash labelled "The King." In the centre, on the line, is a horizontally shaded square, over which is written "My body just before I disappeared." End of reader's note. At the word, I began to move my body out of Lineland. As long as any part of me remained in his dominion and in his view, the King kept exclaiming, "I see you! I see you still! You are not moving!" But when I had at last moved myself out of his line, he cried in his shrillest voice, "She is vanished! She is dead!" "I am not dead," replied I am simply out of Lineland.
that is to say, out of the straight line which you call space, and in the true space where I can see things as they are. And at this moment I can see your line, or side, or inside, as you are pleased to call it, and I can also see the men and women on the north and south of you, whom I will now enumerate, describing their order, their size, and the interval between each. When I had done this at great length, I cried triumphantly, "Does this at last convince you?" And with that I once more entered Lineland, taking up the same position as before. But the monarch replied, "If you were a man of sense, though, as you appear to have only one voice, I have little doubt you are not a man but a woman, but if you had a particle of sense, you would listen to reason. You ask me to believe that there is another line besides that which my senses indicate, and another motion besides that of which I am daily conscious. I, in return, ask you to describe in words, or indicate by motion, that other line of which you speak. Instead of moving, you merely exercise some magic art of vanishing and returning to sight. And instead of any lucid description of your new world, you simply tell me the numbers and sizes of some 40 of my retinue, facts known to any child in my capital. Can anything be more irrational or audacious? Acknowledge your folly, or depart from my dominions." Furious at his perversity, and especially indignant that he professed to be ignorant of my sex, I retorted in no measured terms, "Besotted being! You think yourself the perfection of existence, while you are in reality the most imperfect and imbecile. You profess to see, whereas you can see nothing but a point. You plume yourself on inferring the existence of a straight line, but I can see straight lines, and infer the existence of angles, triangles, squares, pentagons, hexagons, and even circles. Why waste more words? Suffice it that I am the completion of your incomplete self. You are a line, but I am a line of lines, called in my country a square. And even I, infinitely superior though I am to you, am of little account among the great nobles of Flatland, whence I have come to visit you, in the hope of enlightening your ignorance." Hearing these words, the King advanced towards me with a menacing cry, as if to pierce me through the diagonal; and in that same moment there arose from myriads of his subjects a multitudinous war cry, increasing in vehemence, till at last methought it rivalled the roar of an army of 100,000 isosceles, and the artillery of 1,000 pentagons. Spellbound and motionless, I could neither speak nor move to avert the impending destruction; and still the noise grew louder, and the King came closer, when I awoke to find the breakfast bell recalling me to the realities of Flatland. End of Section 14. Recording by Ruth Golding.